Donovan sat on the back porch, watching the sun dip below the horizon over the lake. He thought to himself that they should have made the move years ago. The tranquility and beauty of this place were mesmerizing. The here he was thinking about was a small island off the northern coast of Maine. Over the course of their 22-year marriage, his wife, Rachel, had consistently brought up the idea, gently urging him to leave behind their hectic lives in New York and relocate to where her family had deep roots. Advancements in transportation and technology, combined with the rise of remote work, finally made it possible for Mark to do his job from anywhere, limiting his trips to the city to just once a month. Rachel, who still had a foot in New York, regularly traveled back to the island to stay connected with her family and friends, most importantly, her mother. They had bought the house from one of Rachel's cousins 2 years earlier, but only 6 months ago did they finally make the permanent move. In the meantime, Rachel had used her frequent visits to oversee renovations and turn the place into a home base. The house now faced west, overlooking a bay, giving Mark a breathtaking view of the sunset as he sat with a cold beer in hand. Originally a farm, the property still had meadows and fruit trees around it, with some new saplings likely part of Rachel's landscaping projects last spring. The prevalence of orchards across the island got Mark thinking about whether the trees served as windbreakers from the ocean breeze or if they were planted to produce the beloved apple cider that the locals were so fond of. Either way, he had to admit that Rachel had been right. Life here operated on a different rhythm, centered around close-knit groups, many of which were made up of Rachel's extended family. Rachel seemed to have fully embraced her return to her roots, and it felt like she knew everyone on the island. As an outsider, Mark noticed a certain reserve from the locals, though he appreciated their straightforwardness. The tight community spirit impressed him, leading him to wonder if it came from the self-reliance that small island living demanded. He and Rachel had met at college, both majoring in business. She leaned toward marketing, while he was drawn to new technologies. Their relationship grew quickly, and they married shortly after graduation, deciding to settle in New York for the sake of their careers. Despite 22 years of marriage, Mark still found Rachel beautiful. Her hair, once long, was now styled shorter and often pulled back, with hints of gold accentuating her natural blonde. She was a bit self-conscious about the extra pounds she'd gained over the years, but to Mark, it only made her more attractive, her figure fuller, with her hips and bust now curvier than before. Her eyes, that same blue-gray with flecks of gold, hadn't changed. And unlike him, she never seemed to look unkempt or lounge around in sweats, always maintaining her timeless style. She had never been happier than she was now, fully immersed in island life and juggling various community projects. Her latest endeavor was planning a summer solstice festival. Their 2 daughters, Emily and Laura, were in college now, both studying at Duke University. Part of what motivated their decision to move was knowing the girls were doing well. Judging by their social media, the girls were having the time of their lives at school, even though Emily tended to put things off until the last minute. Mark had taken an interest in the island's history, spending his evenings at the local bar, where he enjoyed listening to the fishermen share their stories. There was a small schoolhouse that doubled as a library and town hall, and Mark often went there to pore over old books chronicling the island's past. One day, while exploring the attic of their house for the first time, he stumbled upon an old box. Inside was a handwritten manuscript, titled Tales of the Island, by Joanna Williams, Rachel's maiden name. Curious, Mark sat down on a wicker stool and began leafing through the pages, appreciating the intricate, swirling handwriting. The manuscript mixed family stories with local legends. One story, in particular, caught his attention, describing a tradition dating back to 1287, during the reign of the Plantagenets. Under something called Jus Primi Noctis, a local lord supposedly had the right to spend the first night with any newlywed bride in his domain. Mark remembered hearing a similar tale in the movie about William Wallace starring Mel Gibson but had always assumed it was Hollywood fiction. As he read on, Mark learned that this law caused significant resentment among grooms at the time. To prevent retaliation, elderly women from the community would step in and spend the night with the groom instead. The story went on to describe how this practice evolved, especially after the plague decimated much of the population. By the early 1600s, the island's community, desperate to survive, allegedly engaged in partner swapping on April Fool's Day as a way to repopulate the island. Later, in the 1950s, Joanna herself took part in a similar tradition. Now in her mid-40s and married, she had offered herself as a surrogate to an 18-year-old named Jack, as part of the local customs. According to the manuscript, this was a way to guide young men into adulthood while also benefiting the older women, who would share wisdom about marriage. Joanna wrote about how Jack, initially shy and awkward, gradually became more confident under her guidance. Mark couldn't believe what he was reading. The details were too bizarre, and while there were historical references that lent credibility to the story, it still felt too far-fetched. Was it simply an imaginative tale meant to justify some questionable practices? He wasn't sure. Still, he found himself fascinated by the old manuscript. Months later, as Mark prepared to return to New York for work, with Rachel's long shopping list in hand, he decided to stay an extra day to catch up with some old friends before heading back. After the festival, Mark planned to return by next Saturday. Rachel was happy to hear this, excited about his help with preparations and the extra hands she'd have for her long shopping list. The festival brought the whole island together, with children's games and sports during the day, and dancing and drinks for adults in the evening. As the night program kicked off, Mark mingled with some islanders he hadn't met before, including Tom Reynolds, his wife Cindy, and their son Sam, who looked around the same age as Mark's youngest daughter. Sam's formal handshake struck Mark as odd, but the moment passed quickly. The Reynolds were one of the island's oldest families, and once again, Mark felt like an outsider as Rachel and the Reynolds chatted about family connections. Later in the evening, Mark noticed a few young men sneaking glances at Rachel. He couldn't blame them, she looked beautiful in her summer dress, which accentuated her curves and long legs. However, the persistent looks started to bother him. Just as he was about to say something, Rachel's mother stepped in, escorting the young men back to the cider bar. Mark smiled to himself, noting how the boys seemed a bit intimidated by Rachel's mother, Deborah. She commanded respect, a strong presence in the community and the head of the Council of Elders. It was obvious where Rachel got her striking looks. Deborah could easily have been mistaken for Rachel's older sister rather than her mother. As Mark returned to watch the dancing, he could feel the effects of the cider but figured he could handle more. The mood was infectious, and it wasn't easy to resist another drink. After a while, Mark noticed that Rachel was missing. He scanned the area and found her in a quiet conversation with Sam Reynolds. As Mark approached, he asked, "What's going on here?" Rachel responded, "Sam's interested in doing some landscaping work. We were just talking about options and prices." "Do we even need landscaping work done?" Mark asked. Rachel smiled. "Yes, actually. And it's tradition to plant new trees around the time of the festival, so it works out perfectly." The mention of trees brought to mind the manuscript Mark had recently read. "So, Sam's going to be planting trees?" Mark asked, his voice cautious. Rachel nodded. "Yeah, he can start next week." Mark eyed her closely. "And what does Sam get in return?" Rachel blinked. "Money, of course. We haven't settled on the exact amount yet." Mark's thoughts drifted to the island's old traditions. "Is there anything else he might get in return?" he pressed. Rachel looked taken aback. "What are you suggesting, Mark?" He hesitated. "This doesn't have anything to do with the island's old customs, does it?" Rachel's eyes narrowed, and she replied sharply, "Are you accusing me of planning to have an affair with Sam Reynolds while you're gone next week?" She suddenly broke into tears and hurried away, leaving Mark standing there, feeling uncertain. Had he misjudged the situation? He regretted drinking so much, his thoughts clouded and muddled. Needing clarity, he began walking back toward their house, the road seeming much longer than usual. By the time he arrived, Rachel was nowhere to be found. Exhausted, he collapsed on the couch, falling into a restless sleep. The next morning, Rachel still hadn't returned. Mark's mind jumped to the worst conclusions. Had she spent the night with someone else? But he suspected she was with her mother, and his suspicion was confirmed when Rachel and Deborah arrived at the door together. Deborah took control of the conversation immediately, scolding Mark for upsetting Rachel and implying that he was never good enough for her daughter. It was a flood of words, hard to keep track of, but the underlying message was clear. How dare he accuse Rachel of something like that? Rachel stood there, her eyes red from crying. Mark couldn't take it anymore and raised his hand, stopping them both. "I have a simple question," he said, looking directly at Deborah. "Is there really a tradition on this island, and are you expecting Rachel to sleep with Sam Reynolds next week?" Rachel turned to her mother, her face filled with resignation. At that moment, everything clicked for Mark. "Yes, Mark," Deborah began. "Some of the older families still follow the tradition, or at least parts of it. The Reynolds have requested it, and we are obligated to respect it. I asked Rachel to consider it. It's about more than just what you're thinking. It's about guiding a boy into adulthood, teaching him how to treat women with respect. It's not what you would call lovemaking, nor is it an affair. It's a tradition that's helped this island through tough times. It's why we have low crime rates among young people, no divorces, and strong, close-knit families. I'm sure you've noticed that yourself. Mark let out a deep sigh. So, it's true then? Married women here are, what, entertaining young men for the good of the community? Deborah shot him a sharp look. Don't be crude. You're not from here, so you don't understand how important this is to us. If you had grown up here, you would have experienced the same benefits when you were 18. And I doubt you would have turned down the opportunity. Maybe not, Mark muttered, his voice laced with sarcasm. But there are no plagues or wars forcing anyone's hand nowadays. You're just doing it because you like it. He paused before adding, how many times have you fulfilled this duty yourself? Deborah was momentarily speechless but quickly recovered. Yes, I've fulfilled my obligations several times, and I'm proud of it. Just as you should be proud of Rachel for making the same sacrifice. Mark shook his head in disbelief. And you, Rachel? You're willing to go through with this? Rachel hesitated before answering. I think so. I'm ready to make the sacrifice. Like my mother said, it's a responsibility. When I left for college and then got married, a lot of people here were disappointed. I didn't come back to fulfill the obligations that others have carried for generations. Mark cut in, so this is a sacrifice? Because from where I'm standing, it sounds like something you wanted to do. Rachel flushed. I felt relieved when we moved, knowing I could manage everything without burdening you. And I'm certain this won't affect our relationship. Mark's tone grew colder. So, being with another man won't affect us? You really believe that? Rachel winced but didn't respond. Deborah stepped in again. Let's all cool off. Nothing has happened yet, and we can still talk about this. For the next few days, Rachel stayed at the house, but the air between them was tense. Mark couldn't understand why she seemed so determined to go through with this tradition, no matter how it impacted their relationship. Rachel insisted that being honest about it would somehow make things better, even if it led to hard conversations. Deborah returned on Wednesday while Rachel was out. Mark suspected they had arranged the meeting in advance. Can we talk? Deborah asked, gesturing toward the kitchen table. Mark sat down across from her. First, I want to apologize, Deborah began. This situation never should have gotten to this point. It's my fault, not Rachel's. Mark shook his head. Rachel's perfectly capable of making her own decisions. It seems like her mind is already made up. Deborah continued, she loves you, Mark. She truly believes that the two of you can get through this together. Mark's voice was quiet but firm. Neither of you seem to understand how much this affects me. It feels like a betrayal. Deborah sighed. I know it's hard for you to grasp. We don't see it as infidelity. It's just part of how we live here. There was a long pause before Deborah spoke again. What if there was a way to balance things out? To give you a chance to experience what you missed at 18? Mark stared at her, confused. Deborah continued, the elders have agreed to extend to you the same offer we've given Rachel. Realization hit Mark like a ton of bricks. Wait, you're saying I should sleep with Mia Brown or Moira Reynolds? Memories of the two women surfaced, Mia, a widow with dark hair and deep brown eyes, still beautiful, and Moira, the school principal, with reddish curls and a graceful figure. Deborah nodded. Yes, Mark. The offer is on the table. Rachel's decision wasn't taken lightly, and we're giving you the same opportunity. Mark shook his head in disbelief. You're an elder, too, Deborah. Are you telling me you'd be part of this arrangement? Deborah hesitated. If that's what you need, Mark, then yes, I would. I won't be the one to break a tradition that's been upheld for centuries. Mark exhaled, astonished at the lengths Deborah was willing to go to. You know, Deborah, some traditions have outlasted their usefulness. Maybe it's time this one fades away. Deborah's smile faded. The offer stands, Mark. You won't regret it. When Mark recounted the conversation to Rachel later, she seemed aware of the elder's proposal. But the idea of Deborah being involved left her shocked and in tears. Mark couldn't believe Rachel had actually considered going through with it. The whole situation had spiraled out of control, and he was at his breaking point. "This has to stop, Rachel," he told her firmly. Rachel looked visibly relieved. "Thank God," she whispered. "I'm so sorry, Mark. I don't know what I was thinking." That night, she spent most of her time apologizing, tears in her eyes, repeatedly telling Mark how much she loved him. But the awkwardness remained, the tension lingering in the air. Mark still couldn't shake off the fact that Rachel had been so close to accepting the proposal, and he wrestled with her belief that it had even been reasonable in the first place. On Friday, Rachel's mother, Deborah, showed up, clearly angry about Rachel's change of heart. She immediately started accusing Mark of being a manipulative outsider who could never understand their traditions. Mark had grown tired of the constant accusations. "Why don't you admit the truth, Deborah?" he shot back. "This isn't about tradition. You just enjoy having power over others. This is your way of taunting your husband." Deborah seemed taken aback but quickly recovered. "Fine, if you want the truth," she snapped. "We do enjoy it. Having a young man at our beck and call is a dream come true. We give them everything, and they're eager to please. Can you even imagine how satisfying that is?" Rachel groaned in frustration. "Mom, please stop. You're ruining everything." Mark chuckled under his breath. "Let her speak," he said. "It's the most honest thing I've heard her say in a long time." Deborah tried to protest, but Rachel cut her off, insisting she leave and not come back until she could support her decision. Mark watched, a bit surprised. It was the first time he had seen Rachel stand up to her mother so forcefully, and it was clear that Deborah hadn't expected it either. She stormed out, leaving an uneasy silence behind. Over the following weeks, Rachel continued to apologize for ever considering the arrangement, explaining that she felt bound by tradition and her mother's influence. She hadn't fully understood the impact it would have on their marriage. Mark could tell she was sincere, but he still found it hard to let go of the unease gnawing at him. He knew he had to return to Philadelphia for work soon, but the idea of leaving Rachel on the island filled him with dread. Sensing his anxiety, Rachel offered to go with him, taking time off from her own job. But Mark told her she couldn't afford to take a break, especially with a major marketing proposal in the works. The tension between Rachel and her mother had deepened, and they weren't speaking. Rachel never brought up the island's tradition again, and after much thought, Mark decided he had to trust her and go back to the city alone. Rachel tried to convince him one last time to let her accompany him, but Mark insisted she focus on her work. She promised to call him daily and keep in touch often. The trip, ferry, taxi, train, and subway, left Mark exhausted, and he collapsed onto his hotel bed by 9 p.m. He called Rachel, and they talked about his journey and the changes happening in the city. Philadelphia seemed to be under constant construction. After their conversation, Mark drifted off into a deep sleep, drained from the long trip. Despite some busy days at work, being away from the island gave Mark clarity. He began thinking more about his relationship with Rachel, replaying their conversations and trying to make sense of her willingness to entertain the island's strange customs. He couldn't ignore the hold that Deborah had over her, and he was glad to see the rift between them. Still, Rachel's certainty that their relationship wouldn't be affected by the arrangement continued to bother him. As his thoughts wandered, he remembered the trees that had been planted on their property in the spring. Rachel had made frequent trips to the island over the last year, and suddenly, an unsettling thought crossed his mind: who had planted those trees? A wave of dread washed over him. Mark picked up his phone and dialed Rachel. "Hey, Mark," she answered cheerfully. Mark's voice was tense. "Does Sam Reynolds have an older brother?" There was a brief pause. "Yes, I think he does." "Why?" "His name is Norman, right? He's about 19? Rachel hesitated. "That's right. And it was Norman who planted the trees last year, wasn't it?" Mark asked, his voice growing more suspicious. There was another pause. "Yes, Norman planted the trees." "What's this about?" Mark pressed further. "And what did Norman get in return for his work?" Rachel's tone shifted, sounding defensive. "What are you getting at, Mark?" "He was paid, of course. That's all." Mark wasn't convinced. "Is that all? There weren't any other arrangements?" Rachel sighed in frustration. "No, Mark. You need to stop being paranoid. There's nothing else going on." Mark hung up the phone before she could say more. He needed time to think, to process everything. A few days later, on Friday, he finally answered one of Rachel's calls. "Mark, thank God you picked up," she exclaimed. "I've been so worried." Mark's voice was cold. "I'm sure you have." Rachel's tone became uncertain. "What time are you coming back tomorrow? Should we talk this over?" "I'm not coming back," Mark replied flatly. "Not yet. I'll be staying here for a while." Panic rose in Rachel's voice. "Please, Mark, don't do this. We need to work through this together." Mark's response was calm but cutting. "We do, but you didn't rush to Philadelphia to fix things. And you've only been calling me during the day. I assume your evenings have been otherwise occupied." "Mark, stop this. I haven't done anything." "It's just in your head," Rachel pleaded. Mark didn't reply and ended the call. 5 days later, Mark returned to the island. As he got off the ferry, he saw Rachel and Deborah waiting for him at the dock. They clearly knew he was coming. Rachel rushed to hug him, but he stepped back, and she burst into tears. Deborah looked furious but didn't say anything. Mark turned to her, his voice firm. "This is between me and Rachel. Why are you here?" Rachel tried to explain. "We had an argument when you didn't come home, and I needed support. Mom was there for me." Mark frowned. "I find it hard to believe your mother just gave in without getting what she wanted. I'm guessing you both agreed to hide it from me because I refused to be part of this ridiculous tradition." Rachel's eyes widened. "Mark, you're twisting everything. I didn't do anything." But Mark wasn't backing down. The argument escalated, going in circles, with Rachel denying any wrongdoing, while Mark remained convinced she had been unfaithful. Eventually, he left them alone and retreated to the spare room, needing space. The next day, Mark decided to confront Rachel's father, Todd. He knew the conversation wouldn't be easy, but he needed answers. Todd greeted Mark with a firm handshake, looking like he had been expecting this talk for a while. They discussed the island's traditions, and Todd admitted that, years ago, Deborah had a brief affair with Tom Reynolds. He didn't approve but chalked it up to youthful indiscretion. When Mark brought up Deborah's recent behavior, Todd looked troubled. "I suspected something was wrong," he said. "I was away on a fishing trip, and it would have been the perfect opportunity." Mark asked if Todd was aware of Rachel's involvement, and Todd nodded. "Deborah and Rachel have always been close. They tried to keep me out of it, but a week before you left, I knew something was going on." Back at the house, Rachel sat at the kitchen table, avoiding Mark's gaze. "I can't believe my dad's divorcing my mom because of us," she muttered. "Your mother made her choices," Mark said coolly. "Your father won't tolerate this level of dishonesty, not after what Tom Reynolds confessed." Rachel was quiet for a long time before finally speaking. "Mark, I'm sorry. I made an arrangement with Sam." Mark didn't respond, just stared at her. "And last year, with Norman," Rachel added softly. Mark shook his head, disbelief washing over him. "This changes everything, Rachel." Tears streamed down her face. "We've had 22 great years together, Mark. How can you say that?" Mark's voice was bitter. "Because this isn't about the past, it's about what you've done." "I'm sorry," Rachel whispered. "I felt obligated to follow the tradition. It was a family thing." "Obligated?" Mark scoffed. "You didn't want to sleep with another man, but you did it anyway, and you enjoyed it enough to do it again." Rachel looked devastated, but she stood her ground. "It wasn't like that, Mark," she said, her voice trembling. "It was just a duty. It was never about love or desire." Mark's expression hardened. "But you still did it. And not just once. Twice. You slept with both brothers before they even turned 19. That doesn't sound like a simple duty to me." Rachel flinched at his words. "I didn't want to hurt you, Mark. I know I've made a mistake. But it wasn't like what we have. It was purely physical, nothing more." Mark's voice was laced with anger. "Physical or not, it was betrayal. And you think that just because it wasn't emotional, it somehow doesn't count? We made vows, Rachel. Do those mean nothing to you?" Rachel looked down, ashamed. "It wasn't like what we have. It was just a tradition. I didn't enjoy it the way I enjoy being with you. It was just fulfilling an obligation." Mark's temper flared. And you expect me to believe that? You slept with them, Rachel. More than once. And for what? Tradition? That's your excuse? Tears welled in Rachel's eyes as she tried to hold her composure. I know I've hurt you, but we've had 22 amazing years together. Doesn't that mean anything? We can get past this, Mark. I love you, and I know you love me. We can fix this. Mark shook his head, his voice low and bitter. You say that, but how can I trust you? You betrayed me, Rachel. Not just by sleeping with those boys, but by lying, by going behind my back. How can I ever believe another word you say? Rachel reached out, her voice desperate. Mark, please, I'm begging you. We can move on from this. It was a mistake, but it doesn't change how much I love you. Please don't let this destroy everything we've built. But Mark stepped back, his expression filled with anger and sorrow. It's too late for that, Rachel. You've already destroyed it. He turned and stormed out of the house, slamming the door behind him. Rachel stood there in silence, tears streaming down her face, realizing that she may have just lost everything. Mark kept walking, hoping the cool evening air would clear his head. But even the stunning sunset over the cliffs failed to lift his mood. As he headed back toward the village, he was surprised to run into Mia Brown, one of the island's elders. He barely managed a nod in response to her greeting, feeling too wrapped up in his own thoughts. Mia smiled knowingly, as though she had anticipated their encounter. She gestured toward a rock ledge nearby and suggested they sit for a while. Cautiously, she asked if Mark wanted to talk about what was troubling him. With a deep sigh, Mark saw no reason to hold back and started to tell her everything. Speaking it all out loud didn't relieve the weight on his shoulders, though. He hesitated when it came to mentioning Deborah's proposition, that one of the elders would sleep with him in exchange for Rachel's fulfillment of her obligations. But since Mia was part of the group, he decided to lay it all out, including the absurd offer verbatim. Mia remained silent for a long time after he finished. Finally, she said, Mark, I never made such an offer. Deborah never discussed any agreements like that with me or Moira. It's not something we would ever consider. Mark stared at her in disbelief as she continued. I think Deborah was trying to manipulate you into agreeing to an extramarital arrangement, just to justify her plans. These kinds of practices mostly died out decades ago, and even back then, they only lasted for a single night, not an entire week. Mark shook his head, still processing the revelation. I can't believe this. Mia went on, what Deborah and her friends might have done in the past, well, that was out of necessity. But now, such things are rare. Deborah has clearly crossed a line. Mia assured Mark that she would discuss the matter with Moira and the other elders and that steps would be taken to strip Deborah of her elder status. It'll be scandalous, she admitted. Nothing like this has happened before, but her behavior is unforgivable. Mark listened quietly. The news felt like another blow. When Mia asked him what he planned to do next, he shrugged. I can't get Rachel to understand the consequences of her actions, but I want her to feel what I'm feeling right now. They sat in silence for a few moments before Mia's lips curled into a faint smile. What's amusing you? Mark asked. Mia's smile grew as she leaned toward him. What if you stayed with me for a week, she proposed. We wouldn't tell Rachel or Deborah. We'd say I was honored to accept the arrangement offered on my behalf as an elder. That way, you give Rachel a taste of her own medicine, and I get to poke at Deborah for dragging me into this mess. Mark was intrigued but voiced his concerns. Won't this damage your reputation? People will talk, and I'm still married. Mia waved off his worries. I couldn't care less about gossip, Mark. And honestly, nearly everyone on the island already knows about your situation. That realization stung, but Mark's spirits lifted at the thought of turning the tables. He grinned. You know, I'd love to plant some trees for you. That might give Rachel and Deborah something to think about. They laughed together, and soon they had settled all the details. Mark returned home and quickly packed his belongings. He told Rachel that after some reflection, he had decided to accept her mother's generous offer regarding the elders. Given the situation, he said, spending a week with another woman seemed perfectly reasonable. Rachel burst into tears, begging him not to go through with it. But Mark left, determined to follow through with his plan. His time with Mia turned out to be unexpectedly pleasant. She was good company and an excellent cook. Mark busied himself with home improvements and even planted a few trees in Mia's backyard. They spoke at length about Mark's predicament, and he hoped the week would help Rachel realize the gravity of what she had done. True to his word, Mark refrained from any intimacy with Mia, though there were a few close calls, not for lack of desire. Mia remained respectful, but the tension between them was undeniable. One day, Rachel confronted Mia at the village store, her voice filled with anger. "How could you do this?" "He's my husband," she accused. Mia smiled sweetly. "Rachel, dear, this isn't an affair. It's an arrangement, just like the one you considered, and it won't affect your marriage. You said so yourself." Rachel was taken aback but persisted. "You can't do this. He's my husband." Mia responded calmly. "I'm just fulfilling the offer made by your mother on my behalf. It could have been Moira or even your mother for a week. Mark made his choice, and I'm bound to honor the tradition. Consider yourself lucky, it could have been worse. He could have chosen Deborah." Rachel's face flushed with frustration. You old hag." Mia remained unflustered. "I would have thought that term would better suit someone who slept with 18-year-old boys behind her loyal husband's back." With that, Mia walked away, leaving Rachel speechless as several villagers watched from the sidelines. The next day, an enraged Rachel showed up at Mia's door, pounding on it so furiously that it seemed she was about to break it down. Mark had to step in to stop her. "Please, Mark, I'm begging you. Come home," she sobbed. Mark shook his head. "I'm just doing what you did. Why are you so upset? This shouldn't concern us, right?" Rachel's face crumpled. "I didn't realize how cruel it was. It's tormenting me. I can't stop thinking about you and her." Mark crossed his arms, his tone cold. "Yes, it sounds familiar. Welcome to my world." He shut the door in her face and returned to Mia's house. The week passed quickly, and when he finally returned home, Rachel was much quieter. She seemed broken. "I can't believe you did this to me," she said. "But I'll forgive you if you can forgive me." Mark stood silently, his face expressionless. Rachel pressed on. "I know how you feel now. But it's only a part of it. You've never dealt with the lies and deceit. Our entire life here is built on lies." Mark sighed heavily. "The same marriage that led you to sleep with other men? A marriage you destroyed. I still can't understand why. Are you truly that tired of me?" Rachel shook her head. "It was never about you. It wasn't boring. We can't go back to the way things were, but we can build something new. We still love each other. We can still have the future we dreamed of, retirement, grandchildren, everything." But Mark wasn't convinced. He remained in the spare room, grappling with the question of what to do next. Could he leave Rachel, the life they had built together, and all their future plans? The island was peaceful, and despite everything, he still loved her. Deep down, he doubted she would ever repeat her actions. But the damage was done. Rachel, meanwhile, couldn't understand how it had come to this. When her mother first proposed the arrangement, she had turned it down. But Deborah had been persistent, and when Rachel met Norman Reynolds at a dance, everything changed. He was charming and good-looking, and they hit it off right away. Deborah had talked endlessly about her own experiences, portraying them as guilt-free, romantic escapades. She had never considered it an affair, just tradition. But Rachel knew Mark didn't see it that way. That's why she had kept it a secret. She told herself that as long as he never found out, it wouldn't hurt him. The week with Norman had been wonderful. He planted trees during the day and spent his nights in her bed, eager to please. Rachel never expected it to go this far. By the end of that week, Norman had become a skilled lover. His size, strength, and newfound patience, combined with what he had learned from Rachel, made him quite adept. Rachel proved to be an excellent teacher, and the experience filled her with a sense of confidence she hadn't felt in years. She realized how much of her sensuality had been overshadowed by the responsibilities of motherhood. Was it tradition, or just illicit lovemaking, as Mark had suggested? She had to admit to herself that it was a bit of both. But after 22 years of raising children and being a devoted wife, didn't she deserve some satisfaction? Rachel was convinced that her actions hadn't damaged her relationship with Mark. In fact, she felt their marriage had never been better. She loved him more than ever, and since that week with Norman, she and Mark had been more intimate than they had in years. But there was also the growing allure of Sam, whose presence stirred feelings of excitement. The thought of sharing her bed with him again crossed her mind more than once. When Mark discovered the truth about the island's tradition through his Aunt Joanna's memoirs, Rachel and her mother had tried to reason with him, hoping he would understand. But Mark had refused to accept it. Now, reflecting on everything, Rachel knew that deceiving him had been the worst decision she'd ever made. Still, she was confident that once the initial pain subsided, she could win him back. She just needed to remind him of the life they had built together, their daughters, their future grandchildren, their dreams. Surely, he wouldn't want to throw it all away. Rachel's optimism, however, was soon shattered. To Mark's surprise, their daughters, Lily and Zara, arrived on the island just 2 days later. Lily wasted no time in confronting him, angrily accusing him of mistreating their mother and scoffing at the idea of their parents living apart. Zara, on the other hand, observed quietly, waiting for more details. Rachel stood by, a slight smile playing on her lips, as if she believed that Mark wouldn't reveal the full truth to their daughters. She assumed, as always, that he would protect them from the reality of her actions. But Mark had had enough. All doubts vanished from his mind, and he decided not to shield the truth any longer. Raising his voice in a way his daughters had never seen before, Mark declared, "Your mother has been involved with younger men, boys, really, who are younger than both of you. She doesn't seem to understand that I won't tolerate this." Rachel tried to refute the claim, insisting that Mark had misunderstood, and that the men were just doing landscaping work. For a brief moment, Mark almost believed her. Rachel had always been persuasive. But both daughters could sense that something was wrong. While their father's accusations seemed far-fetched, they couldn't shake the feeling that he might be right. Mark, still angry but determined to set the record straight, suggested involving their grandfather Todd or the island elders to settle the matter. In response, Rachel attempted to feign a fainting spell, but it was poorly executed. Her daughters and Mark stared at her, unimpressed, waiting for her equally unconvincing recovery. Mark looked at her with cold disdain. "I can't trust you anymore. It's over, Rachel. There's no going back from this. How will you even face yourself in the mirror, knowing that you betrayed me? Nothing can undo that. And how could I live with myself, accepting this?" Rachel, her voice desperate, tried once more. "We need each other, Mark. We've always relied on each other. You're right for me, and I know deep down you still believe that. Don't throw your life away just to punish me." Mark shook his head. "I can handle this, Rachel. But I won't let you drag me down with you. I'll forge a new path, and we'll both have to live with the choices we made. You'll live with the fact that you cheated and lied. I'll live with leaving the woman I loved, but not the person you've become." With that, Mark made the decision to leave the island, taking his daughters with him. They found an apartment closer to their university, and Mark never returned. Before he left, he set fire to the trees in the orchard, trees that had once symbolized a new beginning, but now represented betrayal. Rachel watched from a distance, tears filling her eyes as the orange flames glowed in the night. Todd helped Mark sell the house, as Rachel couldn't afford to maintain it. The fallout from both her divorce and her mother's rocked the island, creating a scandal that effectively ended the remaining traditions. Deborah was the first to be removed from her position as an elder. Both she and Rachel became social outcasts, shunned by the community. No woman on the island trusted or befriended them, yet they definitely remained. Several months later, Mia Brown resigned from her role as an elder. Island residents noticed her spending less and less time there, eventually reducing her visits to just a few weeks each year. When questioned about her absence, Mia revealed that she had moved to Durham, North Carolina, to live with her family. Her departure marked the quiet end of her involvement with the island and its traditions, as she chose to leave the past behind and settle into a new life far from the place that had shaped so much of her history.